Hey there, everybody. So, this is chapter one of Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere. Um, Fair warning, this probably isn't the best for younger kids. So, definitely, I'll keep an eye out for chapters where more unpleasant things happen. But Gaiman is one of the way I love to describe it is that Terry Pratchett is, or sorry, Gaiman is excellent at finding the fantastical in the mundane, and Pratchett is excellent at finding the mundane in the fantastical. And Gaiman definitely has more of a lean towards scary, so might be worth reading before you let dear old Uncle Navi read to your kids. So anyway, the night before he went to London, Richard Mayhew was not enjoying himself. He'd begun the evening by enjoying himself. He had enjoyed reading the goodbye cards, receiving the hugs from several not entirely unattractive young ladies of his acquaintance. He'd enjoyed the warnings about the evils and dangers of London, and the gift of a white umbrella with the map of the London Underground on it that the lads had clubbed together to buy him. He'd enjoyed the first few pints of ale, but then, with each successive pint of ale, he found he was enjoying himself significantly less, until now he was sitting and shivering on the sidewalk outside the pub in a small Scottish town, weighing the conflicting merits of being sick and not enjoying himself at all. Inside the pub, Richard's friends continued to celebrate his forthcoming departure with an enthusiasm that, to Richard's way of thinking, was beginning to border on the sinister. He sat on the sidewalk and held on tightly to the rolled up umbrella and wondered whether going south to London really was a good idea. "You want to keep an eye out," said a cracked old voice. "They'll be moving you on before you can say Jack Robinson. Or taking you in. I wouldn't be surprised." Two sharp eyes stared at him out from a beaky, grimy face. "You all right?" "Oh, yes, thank you," said Richard. He was a fresh-faced, boyish young man with dark, slightly curly hair and large hazel eyes. He had a rumpled, just-woken-up look to him, which made him more attractive to the opposite sex than would ever understand or believe. The grimy face softened. "Here, poor thing," she said, and pushed a 50-pence piece into Richard's hand. "How long you been on the streets, then?" "Oh, I'm not homeless," explained Richard, embarrassed and attempting to give the old woman her coin back. "Please take your money. I'm fine. I just came out to get some air. I go to London tomorrow." She peered down at him suspiciously, then took back her 50 pence and made it vanish beneath the layers of coats and shawls in which she was enveloped. "I've been to London," she confided. "I was married in London, but he was a bad lot. My man told me not to go marrying outside, but I was young and beautiful, although you'd never credit it today, and I followed my heart." "I'm sure that you did," said Richard, embarrassed. The conviction that he was about to be sick was starting, slowly, to fade. "Fat lot of good it done me. I've been homeless, so I know what it's like," said the old woman. "That's why I thought you was. What are you going to London for?" "Oh, I've got a job," he told her proudly. "Doing what?" she asked. Securities." "I was a dancer," said the old woman, and she tottered awkwardly around the sidewalk, humming tunelessly to herself. Then she teetered from side to side like a spinning top coming to rest, and finally she stopped, facing Richard. "Hold out your hand. I'll tell your fortune." And he did as he was told. She put her old hand into his and held it tightly, and then blinked a few times like an owl who had swallowed a mouse that was beginning to disagree with it. "Oh, you got a long way to go," she said, puzzled. "London." "Oh, not just London." The old woman paused. "Not any London I know." It started to rain, and then, softly, "I'm sorry. It starts with doors." "Doors?" She nodded, and the rain fell harder, pattering on the roofs and on the asphalt of the road. "I'd watch out for doors if I were you." Richard stood up, a little unsteadily. "Uh, all right." he said. He was unsure of how one ought to treat information of this nature. I will. Thanks.
The phone is making binky noises because my friends are being
friendly and talkative. The pub door was open, and light and noise spilled out into the street. Richard, you all right? Yeah, I'm fine. I'll be back in a second. The old lady was already wobbling down the street into the pelting rain and getting wet. Richard felt he had to do something for her. He couldn't give her money, though. He hurried after her down the narrow street, the cold rain drenching his face and hair. Here, said Richard. He fumbled with the handle of the umbrella, trying to find the button that opened it. Then, a click, and it blossomed into a huge white map of the London Underground network, each line drawn in a different color, every station marked and named. The old woman took the umbrella gratefully and smiled her thanks. You've got a good heart, she told him. Sometimes that's enough to see you safe wherever you go. Then she shook her head, but mostly it's not. She clutched the umbrella tightly as a gust of wind threatened to tug it away from her, or to pull it inside out. She wrapped her arms around it and bent almost double against the rain and the wind. Then she walked away into the rain and the night, a round white shape covered with the names of London tube stations. Earl's Court, Marble Arch, Blackfriars, White City, Victoria, Angel, Oxford Circus. Richard found himself pondering drunkenly whether there really was a circus at the Oxford Circus, a real circus with clowns and beautiful women and dangerous beasts. But I repeat myself. The pub door opened once more, a blast of sound as if the pub's volume control had been turned up high. Richard, you wanker! It's your bloody party and you're missing all the fun! He walked back in the pub, the urge to be sick lost in all the oddness. You look like a drowned rat, said someone. You've never seen a drowned rat, said Richard. Someone else handed him a large whiskey. Here, get that down you, it'll warm you up. You know you won't be able to get real Scotch in London. I'm sure I will, sighed Richard. Water was dripping from his hair into his drink. They have everything in London. Drink brought to you by Flavor. And he downed his scotch, and after that, someone brought him another, and then the evening blurred and broke up into fragments. Afterward he remembered only the sense that he was leaving somewhere small and sensible that made sense for somewhere huge and old that didn't, and vomiting interminably into a gutter flowing with rainwater. Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, and a white shape marked with strange colored symbols, like a little round beetle, walking away from him in the rain. The next morning, Richard got on the train to London for the 6-hour journey south that would bring him to the strange Gothic spires and arches of St. Pancras Station. His mother gave him a small walnut cake that she had made for the journey and a thermos flask filled with tea, and Richard Mayhew left to London feeling like hell. And since I forgot to mention it, the best way I can describe this book is, what if Alice in Wonderland happened in the London Metro? It's lovely. I guess that was the preface, not chapter 1. I have embarrassed myself. So, chapter 1. She had been running for 4 days now, a harum-scarum tumbling flight through passages and tunnels. She was hungry and exhausted and more tired than a body could stand, and each successive door was proving harder to open. After 4 days of flight, she'd found a hiding place, a tiny stone burrow under the world, where she would be safe, or so she prayed. And at last, she slept. Mr. Croup had hired Ross at the last floating market, which had been held in Westminster Abbey. Think of him, he told Mr. Vandemar, as a canary. Sings? Asked Mr. Vandemar. I doubt it, sincerely and utterly doubt it. Mr. Croup ran a hand through his lank orange hair. No, my fine friend, I was thinking metaphorically, more along the lines of the birds that they take down to the mines. Mr. Vandemar nodded, comprehension dawning slowly. Yes, a canary. Ross had no other resemblance to a canary. He was huge, almost as big as Mr. Vandemar, and extremely grubby and quite hairless, and he said very little, although he had made a point of telling each of them that he liked to kill things, he was good at it, and this amused Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar, much as Genghis Khan might have been amused by the swagger of a young Mongol who had recently pillaged his first village or burnt his first yurt. He was a canary, and he never knew it. So Mr. Ross went first, in his filthy t-shirt and his crusted blue jeans, and Croup and Vandemar walked behind him in their elegant black suits. There are 4 simple ways for the observant to tell Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar apart. First, Mr. Vandemar is 2.5 heads taller than Mr. Croup. Second, Mr. Croup has eyes of faded china blue, while Mr. Vandemar's eyes are brown. Third, while Mr. Vandemar fashioned the rings he wears on his right hand out of the skulls of 4 ravens, Mr. Croup has no obvious jewelry. Fourth, Mr. Croup likes words, while Mr. Vandemar is always hungry. And lastly, they look nothing at all alike. A rustle in the tunnel darkness. Mr. Vandemar's knife was in his hand, and then it was no longer in his hand, and it was quivering gently almost 30 feet away. He walked over to his knife and picked it up by the hilt. There was a gray rat impaled on the blade, its mouth opening and closing impotently as its life fled. He crushed the skull between his fingers and thumb. "Now, there's one rat that won't be telling any more tales," said Mr. Croup. He chuckled at his own joke. Mr. Vandemar did not respond. "Rat. Tales. Get it?" Mr. Vandemar pulled the rat from the blade and began to munch on it, thoughtfully, head first. Mr. Croup slapped it out of his hands. "Stop that!" he said. Mr. Vandemar put his knife away, a little sullenly. "Buck up," hissed Mr. Croup, encouragingly. "There will always be another rat. Now, onward! Things to do, people to damage." 3 years in London had not changed Richard, although it had changed the way he perceived the city. Richard had originally imagined London as a grey city, even a black city from pictures where he had seen, and was surprised to find it filled with color. It was a city of red brick and white stone, red buses and large black taxis, which were often, to Richard's initial puzzlement, gold or green or maroon. Bright red post boxes and green grassy parks and cemeteries. It was a city in which the very old and the awkwardly new jostled each other, not uncomfortably, but without respect. A city of shops and offices and restaurants and homes, of parks and churches, of ignored monuments, and remarkably unpalatial palaces. A city of hundreds of districts with strange names. Crouch End, Chalk Farm, Earl's Court, Marble Arch, and oddly distinct identities. A noisy, dirty, cheerful, troubled city which fed on tourists, needed them as it despised them, in which the average speed of transportation through the city had not increased in 300 years, following 500 years of fitful road widening and unskillful compromises between the needs of traffic, whether horse-drawn or more recently motorized, and the needs of pedestrians. A city inhabited by and teeming with people of every color and manner and kind. When he'd first arrived, he had found London huge, odd, fundamentally incomprehensible. With only the tube map, that elegant multicolored topographical display of underground railway lines and stations, giving it any semblance of order. Gradually he realized that the tube map was a handy fiction that made life easier but bore no resemblance to the reality of the shape of the city above. Like belonging to a political party, he thought once, proudly. And then, having tried to explain the resemblance between the tube map and politics at a party to a cluster of bewildered strangers, he decided in the future to leave political comment to others. He continued, slowly, by a process of osmosis and white knowledge, which is sort of like white noise, only more informative, to comprehend the city, a process which accelerated when he realized that the actual city of London itself was no bigger than a square mile, stretching from Aldgate to the east, in the east to Fleet Street and the law courts of the Old Bailey in the west, a tiny municipality now home to London's financial institutions, and that was where it had all begun. 2,000 years before, London had been a little Celtic village on the north shore of the Thames, which the Romans had encountered and settled in. London had grown slowly until roughly 1,000 years later, it met the tiny royal city of Westminster immediately to the west, and, once London Bridge had been built, London met the town of Southwark directly across the river, and it continued to grow, fields and woods and marshland slowly vanishing beneath the flourishing town, and it continued to expand, encountering other little villages and hamlets as it grew, like Whitechapel and Deptford to the east, Hammersmith and Shepherd's Bush to the west, Camden and Islington to the north, Battersea and Lambeth across the Thames to the south, absorbing all of them as it grew, just as a pool of mercury encounters and incorporates smaller beads of mercury, leaving only their names behind. London grew into something huge and contradictory. It was a good place and a fine city, but there is a price to be paid for all good places, and a price that all good places have to pay. After a while, Richard found himself taking London for granted. In time, he began to pride himself on having visited none of the sights of London, except the Tower of London when his Aunt Maud came down to the city for a weekend, and Richard found himself her reluctant escort. But Jessica changed all that. Richard found himself on otherwise sensible weekends, accompanying her to places like the National Gallery and the Tate Gallery, where he learned that walking around museums too long hurts your feet, and that great art treasures of the world all blur together one after another, or all blur into each other after a while, and that it is almost beyond the human capacity for belief to accept how much museum cafeterias will brazenly charge for a slice of cake and a cup of tea. "Here's your tea and your eclair," he told her. "It would have cost less to buy one of those on excuse me. It would have cost less to buy one of those in Tintoretto's." "Oh, don't exaggerate," said Jessica cheerfully. "Anyway, we aren't at a Tintoretto's there aren't any Tintoretto's at the Tate." Should have had that cherry cake," said Richard. "Then we would have had it. Then they would have been able to afford another Van Gogh." "No," said Jessica accurately, "they wouldn't." Richard had met Jessica in France. In France! On a weekend break in Paris 2 years earlier. Had in fact discovered her in the Louvre, while trying to find the group of his office friends who had organized the trip. Staring up at an immense sculpture, he had stepped backwards into Jessica, who was admiring an extremely large and historically important diamond. He tried to apologize to her in French, which he did not speak, and so gave up and began to apologize in English, and then tried to apologize in French for having to apologize in English, until he noticed that Jessica was about as English as it was possible for any one person to be, by which time she had him buy her an expensive French sandwich and some overpriced fizzy apple juice by way of apology, and, well, that was the start of it all, really. He'd never been able to convince Jessica that he wasn't the kind of person who went to art galleries after that. On weekends, when they did not go to art galleries or to museums, Richard would trail behind Jessica as she went shopping, which she did, on the whole, in affluent Knightsbridge, a short walk and an even shorter taxi ride from her flat in Kensington Mews. Richard would accompany Jessica on her tours of such huge and intimidating emporia as Harrods and Harvey Nichols stores, where Jessica was able to purchase anything from jewelry to books to the week's groceries. Richard had been awed by Jessica, who was beautiful and often quite funny, and was certainly going somewhere, and Jessica saw in Richard an enormous amount of potential, which, properly harnessed by the right woman, would have made him the perfect matrimonial accessory. If only he were a little more focused, she would murmur to herself. And so she gave him books with titles like Dress for Success and 125 Habits of Successful Men, and books on how to run a business like a military campaign, and Richard always said thank you and always meant to read them. In Harvey Nichols' men's fashion department, she would pick out for him the kinds of clothes that she thought that he should wear, and he wore them during the week anyway, and, a year to the day after their first encounter, she told him that she thought it was time that they went shopping for an engagement ring. "Why do you go out with her?" asked Gary in corporate accounts 18 months later. "She's terrifying." Richard shook his head. "I mean, she's really sweet once you get to know her." Gary put down the plastic troll he'd picked up from Richard's desk. "I'm surprised she still lets you play with these." "The subject has never come up," said Richard, picking up one of the creatures from his desk. It had a shock of day-glow orange hair and a slightly baffled expression as if it were lost. The subject had indeed come up. Jessica had, however, convinced herself that Richard's troll collection was a mark of endearing eccentricity, comparable to Mr. Stockton's collection of angels. Jessica was in the process of organizing a traveling exhibition for Mr. Stockton's angel collection, and had come to the conclusion that great men always collected something. In actuality, Richard did not really collect trolls. He'd found a troll on the street outside the office and, in a vague and pretty vain attempt at injecting a little personality into his working world, he'd placed it on his computer monitor. The others had followed over the next few months, gifts from colleagues who had noticed that Richard had a penchant for the ugly little creatures. He'd taken the gifts and positioned them strategically about his desk, beside the telephones and the framed photograph of Jessica. Today, the photograph had a yellow post-it note stuck to it. It was a Friday afternoon. Richard had noticed that events were cowards. They didn't occur singly, but instead they would run in packs and leap out at him all at once. Love that phrase. Take this particular Friday, for example. It was, as Jessica had pointed out to him at least a dozen times in the last month, the most important day of his life. Not the most important day of her life, of course. That would come one day in the future, when, Richard had no doubt, they would make her prime minister, or queen, or god, but it was without question the most important day of his life. So it was unfortunate that, despite the post-it note Richard had left on the fridge door at home, and the post-it note he had placed on the photograph of Jessica on his desk, he'd forgotten about it completely and utterly. Also, there was the Wandsworth report, which was overdue and taking up most of his head. Richard checked another row of figures. Then he noticed that page 17 had vanished, and he set it up to print out again. And another page down, he knew that if he were only left alone to finish it, if, miracle of miracles, the phone did not ring. It rang. He thumbed the speakerphone. "Hello? Richard? The managing director needs to know when he'll have the report." Richard looked at his watch. 5 minutes, Sylvia. It's almost wrapped up. I just have to attach the P&L projection. Thanks, Dick. I'll come down for it. Sylvia was, as she liked to explain, the MD's PA, and she moved in an atmosphere of crisp efficiency. He thumbed the speakerphone off, and it rang again immediately. "Richard," said the speaker, with Jessica's voice. "It's Jessica. You haven't forgotten, have you?" Forgotten? He tried to remember what he could have forgotten. He looked at Jessica's photograph for inspiration and found all the inspiration he could have needed in the shape of a yellow post-it note stuck to her forehead. "Richard, pick up the telephone!" He picked up the phone, reading the post-it note as he did. "Sorry, Jess. No, I hadn't forgotten. 7 p.m. at Mama Son Italiano. Should I meet you there?" "Jessica, Richard, not Jess." She paused for a moment. "After what happened last time, I don't think so. You really could get lost in your own back garden, Richard." Richard contemplated pointing out that anyone could have confused the National Gallery with the National Portrait Gallery, and it wasn't she who had spent the whole day standing in the rain, which was, in his opinion, every bit as much fun as walking around either place until his feet hurt. But he thought better of it. "I'll meet you at your place," said Jessica. "We can walk down together." "Right, Jessica, sorry. You have confirmed our reservation, haven't you, Richard?" "Yes," lied Richard earnestly. The other phone on his desk had begun to ring shrilly. "Jessica, look, Good," said Jessica, and she broke the connection. The largest amount of money Richard had ever spent on anything had been spent on Jessica's engagement ring 18 months earlier at one of Harrod's many jewelry concessions. He picked up the other phone. "Hey, Dick," said Gary. "It's me, Gary." Gary sat a few desks down from Richard. He waved at Richard from his own gleamingly troll-free desk. "We still on for drinks? You said we could go over the Merson account." All of these names are so hard to pronounce because they're impossible to spell. Mersham. Yeah, heck it. Mersham account. "Get off the bloody phone, Gary. Of course we are." Richard put down the phone. There was a telephone number at the bottom of the post-it note. Richard had written the post-it note to himself several weeks earlier, and he had made the reservation. He was almost certain of that, but he had not confirmed it. He kept meaning to, but there had been so much to do, and Richard had known that there was plenty of time, but events run in packs. Sylvia was now standing next to him. "Dick, the Wadsworth report." "Almost ready, Sylvia. Just look, hold on a second. Can you..." He finished punching in the number, breathed a sigh of relief when someone answered. "Maman, can I help you?" Yes," said Richard. "Table for 3 tonight. I think I booked it. And if I did, I'm confirming the reservation, and if I didn't, I wondered if I could book it, please." No, they had no record of a table for tonight in the name of Mayhew or Stockton or Bartram, Jessica's surname. And as for booking a table, it wasn't the words that Richard found so unpleasant. It was the tone of voice in which the information was transmitted. A table for tonight should certainly have been booked years before, perhaps it was implied, by Richard's parents. A table for tonight was impossible. If the Pope, the Prime Minister, and the President of France arrived this evening without confirmed reservations, even they would be turned out on the street with a continental jeer. "But it's for my fiancé's boss. I know I should have phoned before. There's only 3 of us. Can't you please?" They'd put down the phone. "Richard," said Sylvia, "the MD's waiting." "Do you think," asked Richard, "they'd give me a table if I phoned back and offered them extra money?" In her dream, they were all together in the house. The parents, her brother, her babysitter. They were standing together in the ballroom, staring at her. They were all so pale, so grave. Portia, her mother, touched her cheek and told her that she was in danger. In her dream, Dora laughed and said she knew. Her mother shook her head. No. Now she was in danger. Now. Dora opened her eyes. The door was opening quietly, quietly. She held her breath. Footsteps, quiet on the stone. Perhaps he won't notice me, she thought. Perhaps he'll go away. And then she thought, desperately, I'm so hungry. So, gotta mention, the next couple of pages can be a little gross. So I'll just hold my finger up. When it gets gross, you can fast forward. The footsteps hesitated. She was well hidden, she knew, under a pile of newspapers and rags. And it was possible that the intruder meant her no harm. Can't he hear my heartbeat? She thought. And then the footsteps came closer, and she knew what she had to do, and it scared her. A hand pulled the covers off her, and she looked up into a blank, utterly hairless face, which creased into a vicious smile. She rolled then and twisted, and the knife blade, aimed at her chest, caught her in the upper arm. Until that moment, she'd never thought that she could do it. Never thought that she would be brave enough, or scared enough, or desperate enough to dare. But she reached up one hand to his chest, and she opened. He gasped and tumbled onto her. It was wet and warm and slippery, and she slithered and staggered out from under the man as she stumbled out of the room. She caught her breath in the tunnel outside, narrow and low, as she fell against the wall, breathing in gasps and sobs. That had taken the last of her strength. Now she was spent. Her shoulder was beginning to throb. The knife, she thought, but she was safe. "My, oh my," said a voice from the darkness on her right. "She survived Mr. Ross. Well, I never, Mr. Vandermeer." The voice oozed. It sounded like grey slime. "Well, I never either, Mr. Croup," said a flat voice on her left. The light was kindled and flickered. "Still," said Mr. Croup, his eyes gleaming in the dark beneath the earth, "she won't survive us." Dora kneed him hard in the groin, and then she began randomly to run, her right hand holding her left shoulder, and she ran. "Dick?" Richard waved away the interruption. Life was almost under his control now. Just a little bit more time. Gary said his name again. "Dick, it's 6:30. "It's what?" Papers and pens and spreadsheets and trolls were tumbled into Richard's briefcase. He snapped it shut and ran. He pulled his coat on as he went, Gary following. "Are we going out for that drink, then?" "Drink? We were meant to be getting together this evening to talk about the Mersham account, remember?" "That was tonight. Oh." Richard paused for a moment. If ever he decided they made disorganization an Olympic sport, he could be disorganized for Britain. Gary, I'm sorry. I blew it. I have to see Jessica tonight. We're taking her boss out to dinner. Mr. Stockton? Of Stockton? The Stockton? They hurried down the stairs. Well, I'm sure you'll have fun, said Gary insincerely. And how is the creature from the Black Lagoon? Jessica's from Ilford, actually, Gary, and she remains the light and love of my life. Thank you very much for asking. By which time they were in the lobby, and Richard made a dart for the automatic doors, which spectacularly failed to open. It's after 6, Mr. Mayhew, said Mr. Figgis, the building security guard. You have to sign out. I don't need this, said Richard to no one in particular. I really don't. Mr. Figgis smelt vaguely of medicinal liniment, and was widely rumored to have an encyclopedic collection of softcore pornography. He guarded the doors with a diligence that bordered on madness, never quite having lived down the evening when an entire floor's worth of computer equipment up and left, along with 2 potted palms and the managing director's Axminster carpet. So drinks off then. I'm sorry, Gary. Is Monday okay for you? Sure, fine. Monday's fine. See you Monday. Mr. Figgis inspected their signatures and satisfied himself that they had no computers, potted palms, nor carpets about their persons. Then he pressed a button under his desk, and the door slid open. Ugh, doors. The underway branched and divided. She picked her way at random, ducking through tunnels, running and stumbling and weaving. Behind her strolled Mr. Krupp. Maybe that's supposed to be Mr. Krupp. And Mr. Vandermoor, as calmly and cheerfully as Victorian dignitaries visiting the Crystal Palace exhibition. When they arrived at a crossroads, Mr. Krupp would kneel and find the nearest spot of blood, and they would follow it. They were like hyenas exhausting their prey. They could wait. They had all the time in the world. Luck was with Richard for a change. He caught a black taxi driven by a particularly enthusiastic taxi driver, who took Richard home by an unlikely route involving streets Richard had never previously noticed, while holding forth as Richard had discovered all London taxi drivers will hold forth, given a living, breathing, English-speaking passenger, on London's inner-city traffic problems, how best to deal with crime, and the thorny political issues of the day. Richard jumped out of the cab, leaving a tip and his briefcase behind, managed to flag down the cab again before it made it into the main road, and so got his briefcase back, and then he ran up the stairs and into his flat. He was already shedding clothes as he entered the hall. His briefcase spun across the room and crash-landed on the sofa. He took his keys from his pocket and placed them carefully on the hall table in order to ensure that he did not forget them. Then he dashed into the bedroom. The buzzer sounded. Richard, 3/4 of his way into his best suit, launched himself at the entry phone. "Richard, it's Jessica. I hope you're ready." "Oh, yes, be right down." He pulled on a coat and he ran, slamming the door behind him. Jessica was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. She always waited for him there. Jessica didn't like Richard's flat. It made her feel uncomfortably female. There was always the chance of finding a pair of Richard's underwear, well, anywhere, not to mention the wandering lumps of congealed toothpaste in the bathroom sink. No, it was not a Jessica kind of place. Jessica was very beautiful. So much so that Richard would occasionally find himself staring at her, wondering, how did she end up with me? And when they made love, which they did at Jessica's Mews flat in fashionable Kensington, in Jessica's brass bed with a crisp white linen sheets, for Jessica's parents had told her that eiderdowns were decadent. In the darkness afterward, she would hold him very tightly, and her long brown curls would tumble over his chest, and she would whisper to him how much she loved him, and he would tell her he loved her and always wanted to be with her, and they both believed it to be true. Which is one of the most sad lines in this book.
Making sure Opal's not eating stuff. Oh, she's just licking on her paws. That's okay. That's what paws are for.
Oh, bless me, Mr. Vandermarsh, she's slowing up. Slowing up, Mr. Krupp. She must be losing a lot of blood, Mr. V. Ah, lovely blood, Mr. C. Lovely wet blood. Not long now. A click. The sound of a switchblade opening, empty and lonely and dark. "Richard, what are you doing?" "Nothing, Jessica. You haven't forgotten your keys again, have you?" "No, Jessica." Richard stopped patting himself and pushed his hands deep into the pockets of his coat. "Now, when you meet Mr. Stockton tonight," said Jessica, "you have to appreciate that he's not just a very important man, he's also a corporate entity in his own right." "I can't wait."
Man, I feel like I got a mosquito.
"I can't wait," sighed Richard. "What was that, Richard?" "I can't wait," said Richard, rather more enthusiastically. "Oh, do step lively," said Jessica, who was beginning to exude an aura of what, in a lesser woman, might have almost been described as nerves. "We mustn't keep Mr. Stockton waiting." "No, Jess." "Don't call me that, Richard. I loathe pet names. They're so demeaning." "Spare any change?" A man sat in the doorway. His beard was yellow and gray, his eyes sunken and dark. A hand-lettered sign hung from a piece of frayed string around his neck and rested on his chest, telling anyone with the eyes to read it that he was homeless and hungry. It didn't take a sign to tell you that. Richard, his hand already in his pocket, fumbled for a coin. "Richard, we haven't got the time," said Jessica, who gave to charity and invested ethically. "Now, I want you to make a good impression, fiancé-wise. It is vital that a future spouse makes a good impression." And then her face creased, and she hugged him for a moment and said, "Oh, Richard, I do love you. You know that, don't you?" And Richard nodded, and he did. Jessica checked her watch and increased her pace. Richard discreetly flicked a pound coin back through the air toward the man in the doorway, who caught it with one grimy hand. "There wasn't any problem with the reservations, was there?" asked Jessica. And Richard, who was not much good at lying when faced with a direct question, said, "Ah." She'd chosen wrongly. The corridor ended when... That was weird. I had a flub, a hiccup, and a burp at the same time. The corridor ended in a blank wall. Normally that would have hardly given her pause, but she was so tired, so hungry, and in so much pain. She leaned against the wall, feeling the brick roughness against her face. She was gulping breath, hiccuping and sobbing. Her arm was cold, her left hand was numb. She could go no further, and the world was beginning to feel very distant. She wanted to stop, to lay down, and to sleep for 100 years. "Oh, bless my little black soul, Mr. Vandermont. Do you see what I see?" The voice was soft, close. They must have been nearer to her than she had imagined. "I spy with my little eye something that's going to be..." "Dead minute, Mr. Krupp," said the flat voice from above her. "Our principal will be delighted." The girl pulled whatever she could find from inside her soul, through all the pain and the heart, and the hurt and the fear. She was spent, burnt out, and utterly exhausted. She had nowhere to go, no power left, no time. "If it's the last door I open," she prayed silently, to the temple, to the arch. Somewhere, safe. And then she thought wildly, somebody. And as she began to pass out, she tried to open a door. As the darkness took her, she heard Mr. Krupp's voice, as if from a long way away. It said, "Oh, bugger and blast!" Jessica and Richard walked down the street towards the restaurant. She had her arm through his and was walking as fast as her heels permitted. He hurried to keep up. Street lights and the fronts of stores were closed, the fronts of closed stores illuminating their path. They passed a stretch of tall, looming buildings, abandoned and lonely, bounded by a high brick wall. "You are honestly telling me that you had to promise them an extra 50 pounds for our table tonight? You are an idiot, Richard," Jessica said, her dark eyes flashing and not even slightly amused. "They'd lost my reservation, and they said all the tables were booked." Their steps echoed off the high walls. "Well, they'll probably have us sitting by the kitchen," sighed Jessica. "Or the door. Did you tell him it was for Mr. Stockton?" "Yes," replied Richard. She continued to drag him along, as a door opened in the wall a little way ahead of them, and someone stepped out and stood swaying for one long terrible moment, and then collapsed to the concrete. Richard shivered and stopped in his tracks. Jessica tugged him into motion. Now, when you're talking to Mr. Stockton, you must be sure that you don't interrupt him or disagree with him. He doesn't like to be disagreed with. When he makes a joke, laugh. If you're in any doubt as to whether or not he's made a joke, just look at me and I'll tap my forefinger. They'd reached the person on the sidewalk. Jessica stepped over the crumpled form. Richard hesitated. Jessica? Oh, you're right. He might think I'm bored, she mused. I know. If he makes a joke, I'll rub my earlobe. Jessica! He could not believe that she was simply ignoring the figure at their feet. What? She was not pleased to be jerked out of her reverie. Look! He pointed to the sidewalk. The person was face down and enveloped in bulky clothes. Jessica took his arm and tugged him toward her. Oh, I see. Well, if you pay them any attention, Richard, they'll walk all over you. They all have homes, really. Once she's slept it off, I'm sure she'll be fine. She? Richard looked down. It was a girl, Jessica continued. Now, I've told Mr. Stockton that we... Richard was down on one knee. Richard, what are you doing? She isn't drunk, said Richard. She's hurt. He looked at her fingertips. She's bleeding. Jessica looked down at him, nervous and puzzled. We're going to be late. She's hurt. Jessica looked back at the girl on the sidewalk. Priorities. Richard had no priorities. Richard, we're going to be late. Someone else will be along. Someone else will help her. The girl's face was crusted with dirt, and her clothes were wet with blood. She's hurt, he said, simply. There was an expression on his face that Jessica hadn't seen before. Richard, she warned, and then she relented a little and offered a compromise. Richard, dial 999 and call an ambulance then, quickly now. Suddenly the girl's eyes opened, white and wide, in a face that was little more than a smudge of dust and blood. Not a hospital, please, they'll find me. Take me somewhere safe, please. Her voice was weak. You're bleeding, said Richard. He looked to see where it was coming from. There. He looked to see where she'd come from, but the wall was blank and brick and unbroken. He looked back to her still form and asked, why not a hospital? Help me, the girl whispered, and her eyes closed. Again he asked her, why don't you want to go to a hospital? But this time there was no answer at all. When you call the ambulance, said Jessica, don't give them your name. You might have to make a statement or something, and then we'd be late, and I'm not having this evening ruined by... Richard? Richard, what are you doing? Richard had picked the girl up, cradling her in his arms. She was surprisingly light. I'm taking her back to my place, Jess. I can't just leave her. Tell Mr. Stockton I'm really sorry, but it was an emergency. I'm sure he'll understand. Richard Oliver Mayhew, said Jessica coldly. You put that young person down and you come back here right this minute, or the engagement is at an end as of now. I'm warning you. Richard felt the sticky warmth of blood soaking into his shirt. Sometimes he realized there is nothing you can do, and he walked away. Jessica stood there on the sidewalk watching him ruin her big evening, and her eyes stung with tears. After a while, he was out of sight, and then, and only then, did she say loudly and distinctly and unladylike, Shit! And then she flung her handbag as hard as she could onto the ground, hard enough to scatter her mobile phone and her lipstick and her planner and a handful of tampons across the concrete. And then, because there was nothing else to do, she picked them all up, put them back into her handbag, and walked back down to the restaurant to wait for Mr. Stockton. Later, as she sipped her white wine, she tried to come up with plausible reasons why her fiancé was not with her, and found herself wondering desperately whether or not she could simply claim that Richard was dead. It was very sudden, said Jessica, wistfully, under her breath. Richard did not, at any point on his walk, stop to think. It was not something over which he had any volition. Somewhere in the sensible part of his head, someone, a normal, sensible Richard Mayhew, was telling him how ridiculous he was being, that he should have just called the police or an ambulance, that it was dangerous to lift an injured person, and that he had really, really, seriously, properly upset Jessica, and that he was going to have to sleep on the sofa tonight, that he was spoiling his only good suit, and that the girl smelled quite dreadful. But Richard found himself placing one foot in front of the other, and, arms cramping and back hurting, and ignoring the looks he got from the passerby, he just kept walking. And after a while, he was at the ground floor door of his building, and he was stumbling up the staircase. And then he was standing in front of the door to his flat and realized that he had left his keys on the hall table inside. The girl reached out one filthy hand to the door, and it swung open. Never thought I'd be pleased that the door hadn't latched properly, thought Richard, and he carried the girl in, closing the door behind him with his foot, and he put her down on his bed. His shirt front was soaked with blood. She seemed semi-conscious, her eyes closed, but fluttering. He peeled off her leather jacket. There was a long cut on her upper left arm and shoulder. Richard caught his breath. "Look, I'm gonna call a doctor. Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened wide and scared. "Please, no. It'll be fine. It's not as bad as it looks. I just need sleep. No doctors." "But your arm, your shoulders." "It'll be fine. Tomorrow. Please." It was little more than a whisper. I suppose. All right. And with sanity beginning to assert itself, he said, "Look, can I ask?" But she was asleep. Richard took an old school scarf from his closet and wrapped it firmly around her left upper arm and shoulder. He did not want her to bleed to death on his bed before he could get her to a doctor. And then he tiptoed out of his bedroom and shut the door behind him. He sat down on the sofa in front of the television and wondered what he had done. So, I think that is a good start. We are now 31 pages into a there's an extra short story at the end. I forgot about that. Or rather, I didn't read it. So we are on page 31 of 396. So should be a couple weeks, which is good. So, in the meantime, you have more important things to do than listen to me prattle. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And remember that if people can hate for no reason, then I don't need a reason either to love you. So, sleep well, dear.